When I was just a little kid, my dad and mom would often take me to the racetrack. You might be thinking a family at a racetrack, but recent racetracks are very well maintained, with adorable ponies for kids to ride and even huge trampolines. Every morning, my mom would make a lavish three-tiered lunchbox, and hand in hand with my parents, I'd hop on the train. There were so many families around, and I always looked forward to going to the racetrack. We'd spread out a picnic blanket on the vast grassy area, and after eating our fill of the lunch, we'd go see the horses. Being lifted up on my tall dad's shoulders, I could see the horses in the paddock so clearly. Every horse gleamed and looked at us with gentle eyes. For my dad back then, going to the racetrack was less about betting and more of a family event to watch his favorite horses. While watching the races together, my dad would tell me all kinds of stories. Stories like the sad tale of a horse that broke its leg during a race rushing desperately to the jockey it had thrown off, or the legendary story of an unimpressive horse from a small town becoming the winner of the National Derby, or even more thrilling than any fairy tales.
You know, my dream was to go to Montana and work on a ranch. My dad was really against it and I gave it up.
My dad, following in my grandpa's footsteps, worked as a head carpenter. Though he was proud of his current job, there was a hint of sadness when he talked about his childhood dream. Then, a decade passed, and a tragedy struck when I was 15 in winter. Walking home from work one night, my dad was hit by a car coming from behind. Thankfully, it wasn't life-threatening, but he badly injured his right leg and started to limp ever since the accident. He couldn't continue his carpentry work in that condition. Despite diligently attending physiotherapy, his leg wouldn't cooperate. Eventually, he grew weary of the physical therapy, and I had to drag him to the hospital. "All right, Dad, I'll be waiting in the library as usual. Hang in there for the therapy." Saying that, my dad gave a weak smile. Looking at his retreating figure heading to the therapy room, he seemed so much smaller. I felt a deep sadness. The once robust and dependable dad seemed so worn out in just 3 months after the accident. I almost burst into tears, but collected myself and headed to the hospital's library. This hospital had a small library specifically for inpatients. Located near the therapy room and part of the pediatric ward, it was a great place to kill time. Though I wasn't a patient, I had made friends with a little girl, which allowed me special access.
"Ah, you're here. Kathy, over here."
Sophie called out to me. She is a 10-year-old girl admitted to the pediatric ward. We became friends after I returned a lost stuffed animal to her, and thanks to her love for books and always being in the library, I gained entry. "Sorry, kept you waiting." As I sat in front of Sophie, she shook her head and gave a bright smile.
"Not at all. Did you bring the picture book?"
Blushing with anticipation, Sophie asked that. Suddenly feeling shy, I replied, "I brought it, but it's really amateurish. You're getting my hopes up and it's kind of embarrassing." Seeing my hesitance, Sophie laughed.
"It's okay. I love your drawings."
Encouraged by her innocent smile, I took out the picture book I had created. I love drawing, and my dream was to become a children's book author. Last time, when I showed Sophie my drawings, she liked them so much that I accidentally mentioned the picture book I was working on. She begged to see it, so I brought it today. I cautiously placed the book in front of Sophie, and she instantly began reading it. The story was about a young horse that journeyed to heaven, met many stars, and eventually became a beautiful star itself. Sophie was engrossed, reading with great interest. I watched her, my heart racing, waiting for her reaction.
"It's wonderful."
After a while, Sophie murmured, "Did you like it?" Relieved, I asked, but then noticed Sophie looking at me with teary eyes. Seeing the large tears welling up in her eyes, I panicked. What had happened?
"No, it's not what you think. I'm sorry for startling you."
Saying that with a smile, Sophie wiped away her tears with her hand.
"It was such a touching story, it made me cry. The little foal became a star surrounded by everyone, huh? He must not be lonely."
Hearing that, I nodded earnestly. I didn't know exactly why Sophie was in the hospital, but could she possibly be suffering from a serious illness? If so, did I inadvertently make her read a rather cruel story?
"Hey, Kathy. Do me a lifetime favor. Can you give this to me?"
Being asked with such a serious face, I of course agreed. I'm glad she liked it. Relieved, I drew various pictures for Sophie as she requested that day. We spent about an hour that way, and I stood up when my father's physical therapy was about to end. See you next week, Sophie.
Yeah. I'll be waiting.
Waving goodbye, we parted ways. That was the last time I ever saw Sophie. My father didn't go for his physical therapy anymore. No matter how much I pleaded, and no matter how angry my mom got, he just refused, saying he didn't want to.
No matter how hard I try, this leg will never recover. The days of me climbing ladders are over.
After saying that, he stopped going to work altogether. My father, who used to be a lead carpenter, started doing manual labor like cleaning and carrying materials at the site after his leg worsened. It seemed he couldn't bear being ridiculed by the younger workers. When he stopped working, he started gambling all day, weekdays at the slot machines and weekends at the horse races. Naturally, our finances worsened, leading to constant fights between him and Mom. My father, who had been taking cash advances on his credit card, got it confiscated by my mom and turned to loan sharks. By the time I was in my sophomore year of high school, my mother finally left. It seemed she had found someone else at her part-time job.
You've always adored your dad, Kathy.
She said that without any hesitation and left me behind. The only thing she left was my father's enormous debt. I desperately wanted my father to recover, so I kept encouraging him. Even in such a state, I loved my dad. Inspired by the many stories he told me, I wanted to become a children's book author. Back then, the view I got when my dad lifted me onto his shoulders meant everything to me. I wanted my dad to regain that sparkle. My father tried to go back to work to respond to my feelings, but he'd get discouraged after just 2 or 3 days. Then, he'd return to gambling. Months went by in this repeated cycle, and by the time I graduated from high school, our debt had ballooned to an unmanageable size. I gave up going to art college, and instead, I worked at a restaurant during the day and searched for night jobs. Since high-end clubs only hire those 20 and older, I considered working at a bar and attended several interviews. That's when a talent scout introduced me to a high-end club that offered me an incredible deal. $350 daily wage, and since I was underage, I wouldn't have to drink. They would lend me dresses, and there were no quotas. The gorgeous head lady, who looked like a movie star, eagerly asked me to start the very next day, and for the first time in a long while, I went home in high spirits. My first night job was much more enjoyable than I had anticipated. The senior ladies were all very kind, and the customers were all sophisticated. Seeing a man around my dad's age casually spend $10,000 in one night made me realize that there are all kinds of people in the world, which left me with mixed feelings. After I started working at the club, our financial situation improved a bit, but repaying my father's debt was still a long way off. My father apologized many times, blaming himself for my giving up on our college. But he just couldn't quit gambling. He must be addicted. I had no idea how to make him stop. 3 months went by, and just as I was getting used to the job, an incident occurred. It was a busy Friday night. A man in a suit yelled, "Leave now." When I looked over, a group of rough-looking young men stood at the entrance. They wore ragged jeans and flashy shirts, clearly out of place. One man pushed past the bouncer and yelled, "Where's Kathy Nelson? Kathy Nelson, where are you?" I was so surprised that I stood up.
You must be John's daughter. I've been looking for you.
Smirking, one of the men approached me. The bouncer stepped in, but the man shook him off, punching the bouncer and stood in front of me.
You see, your dad hasn't been paying back the money he owes. It's not good. You know, if you borrow something, you gotta pay it back.
His words, said in a smooth tone, left me breathless. The entire place went silent, and I could feel everyone's gaze piercing through me. Embarrassed and tense, I couldn't muster a word. The man grabbed my wrist and pulled me forcefully. "Hey, let go."
No matter how much you work in this fancy place, you can't pay off the debt, can you? I can offer you a better job. Just come with me.
Although I resisted with all my might, the man's friends surrounded me and dragged me toward the entrance. Just then, a deep voice said, "What do you think you're doing?" The man holding my hand was suddenly grabbed by the collar by someone. The next moment, he was thrown to the ground.
What the hell are you doing?
The man scrambled to his feet and lunged at the figure in front of him. However, the figure easily dodged his punch and looked at me. He was a man in his 40s, wearing a gray suit. Was he a customer? I didn't recognize him.
What the hell do you think you're doing is what I want to ask. Who are you punks? You think you can do this in my place and just walk away?
The man spoke in a quiet but intimidating voice. My place. Is he the owner?
Shut up. We just came to collect the money we're owed. We only have business with this young lady here. You have nothing to do with it.
The man yelled defiantly, despite being visibly shaken. The owner was silent for a moment, then asked calmly, "How much?" "It's $30,000, the man answered. $30,000. Dad, why? Heartbroken, I whispered to myself. Everything seemed to go dark before my eyes. Catching a glimpse of my state, the owner said to the manager, "Hey." The manager nodded and disappeared into the back of the store. He quickly returned, handing a thick envelope to the owner.
Here's the $30,000. Take it and get out.
With that, he threw the envelope to the man. Surprised, the man hastily checked its contents.
I'll let you go this time, but if you ever pull this kind of stunt in my place again, you won't be walking around here anymore. Be prepared.
With those intimidating words, the men ran off as if fleeing. Then, with a smile, the owner said loudly, "Sorry for the commotion, folks."
It's on me tonight. Everyone, have a good time. Hey, bring all the crystal rose you got.
Following his orders, the bouncers distributed champagne bottles to every table. The previously silent place became lively in an instant, and the hostess called for a toast. "I'm so sorry." I bowed deeply to the owner, apologizing. "I caused trouble for the club. I'll surely pay back the money." But he looked at me coldly and said, "That won't be necessary."
From tomorrow on, you don't have to come in.
With that, he walked away. I was fired. The next day, when I came home from my afternoon shift, the owner was there, sitting opposite my dad in our worn-out living room. I was taken aback when I saw several thick envelopes on the table. Realizing their implications, I hurried into the room. "Dad, this." Picking up one of the envelopes and checking its contents, it was filled with bundles of banknotes as I suspected.
I've settled all your dad's debts. I've also offered him a new job. I told him I want you as my wife.
He said calmly and plainly. I was at a loss, not understanding what he meant. All I could do was stare back and forth between the owner and my dad.
You see, he got me a gig at a ranch in Montana that a friend of him owns.
My dad added in a soft voice, "Mr. Edwards." So his name is Mr. Edwards. I realized I didn't even know the owner's name. Me becoming this man's wife, even though I just met him yesterday. It felt so absurd I almost laughed out loud. What kind of joke is this?
Here's $100,000. After paying off your debts, there'd still be enough left to settle down in Montana. Doesn't sound like a bad deal, right?
Edwards spoke in his usual calm voice. Dad glanced at me briefly, then pushed back the envelope towards Edwards.
I appreciate the offer, but no thanks. No matter how much of a mess I've been, I can't sell off my daughter, who's been supporting me all this time. That would make me worse than an animal.
In the end, he shouted, glaring at Edwards. Edwards looked at me intensely, his eyes silently asking, "What's your decision?" I felt like I was in a dream. It all seemed so surreal. Marrying a man I just met the day before. Someone who seemed so much older than me. Who would seriously consider such a thing? Seeing me without a response, Edwards sighed. He turned to my dad. "Wasn't working at a ranch your dream? Wouldn't it be better to reset in Montana than keep gambling and borrowing from thugs?" Hearing those words, I was taken aback inside. How did he know about my dad's dream? Could it be he had this all planned out? Who on earth is this man? Hiding my turmoil, I looked down at my shrunken, frail dad. He seemed so thin, so diminished. Perhaps this was his last chance. With that thought, I clenched my hands. Mustering my courage, I looked up at Edwards. "I'll marry you." Hearing this, my dad shouted in shock. "No."
Kathy, anything but that. I promise I'll pull myself together from today.
"I've had enough." As I shouted, my dad's eyes widened in shock. "I'm done being manipulated by your debts. Just leave, whether it's Montana or wherever. Just get out of my life. Hearing this, my dad's shoulders slumped. I felt like crying, but gritted my teeth. A heavy silence filled the room.
John, sorry to intrude, but I'd like a moment alone with Kathy. Could you let us talk?
With that, Edwards took my arm and we stood up. Dad said nothing. We stepped outside and got into Edward's car parked out front. There was so much I wanted to ask, but the words wouldn't come.
You said that for your dad's sake, didn't you?
In a surprisingly gentle voice, Edward said this. At that moment, I could no longer hold back my tears.
You've gone through so much, but you've never lost your compassion. You're an incredible person, just like Sophie said.
Hearing the name Sophie, I looked at Edwards in surprise. Recalling the smiling face of Sophie, the little girl who loved looking at picture books. Sophie, you mean that little Sophie? How do you know her? Who are you? As I got excited, Edwards, with a gentle smile, began to explain.
Sophie was my daughter. She passed away from leukemia a year after meeting you.
In a voice tinged with deep sorrow, he continued.
I heard about you every day from her. She was overjoyed to have met her very first friend in you. She seemed genuinely happy every day after meeting you.
With that, Edwards took a book out of his bag and handed it to me. It was a picture book I had given Sophie a long time ago.
She read that book every day. She called it her treasure. Thanks to that book, my 10-year-old girl wasn't afraid of death. She believed she was turning into a beautiful star and went to heaven.
Recalling that time, there was a tremble in Edward's voice.
Can you imagine how grateful I am to you? Sophie was worried about you after you guys parted ways. I promised her I'd check on you, so I asked the nurses about you, then had one of my guys find out more about you.
About me?
Yep, I easily found out about your family situation. It's like the saying, takes one to know one. Given my line of work, I have plenty of contacts in that world. It didn't take me long to find out about your dad's gambling addiction and his debts.
Saying this, Edwards looked at me with a mix of pity and understanding.
I told Sophie that you moved to a distant city, Kathy. I couldn't tell her that her dear friend Kathy was struggling because of her father's debts. But before Sophie passed away, she told me, Daddy, please help Kathy. It was surprising. She must have felt something.
Thinking about what he said, memories of the past rushed back to me. I don't remember telling Sophie in detail about my family, but I might have mentioned something about my father.
After Sophie passed, my wife left. She said she couldn't bear living with me because it reminded her of Sophie. I've been searching for you ever since because of Sophie's last wish. I knew you were looking for a night job, so I had my scout approach you. I offered an underage girl like you an extraordinary salary, hoping it would help a bit. But after what happened yesterday, I can't just stand by any longer.
With that, Mr. Edwards gazed at me intently.
Kathy, I'm not asking you to love me. If you're uncomfortable with an old man like me, I promise not to touch you. Think of me as a father figure, but please, let me make you happy.
Stunned, I just stared back at him, wondering, why is he going to such lengths for a stranger like me, just because of Sophie's wish? Even though he couldn't hear my thoughts, Mr. Edwards looked away and said shyly,
You might not believe me. You might find it creepy, but I've grown fond of you. The more I got to know you, the more I was drawn to your strong-willed nature. It's not just out of pity that I'm proposing.
Seeing a grown man blushing like that made me blush too. I didn't love him. How could I have feelings for someone I just met yesterday? But I believed he was a good person. 5 years later, thanks to Henry Edwards, I was able to attend a vocational school and now work at a small company creating children's books. I'm going to be late. As I opened the door to the living room, there was Henry, sitting on the couch, amusing our daughter, Julie, who gave me a mock-exasperated look.
Kathy, you're late every day. Not the best mom, huh?
Lifting Julie up in the air, her joyful giggles filled the room. Just then, the doorbell rang, and upon answering, the babysitter greeted us with a good morning and stepped inside. Sorry and thank you. I'll be back by 6 p.m. After saying that, the babysitter replied with a nod and a smile. Bye, Henry. Bye, Julie. See you later. I gave Julie a kiss on the forehead and pecked Henry on the cheek. The ever-shy Henry turned beach red. The babysitter commented, You two are such a lovely couple. Over the years, Henry cherished and loved me more than I could have asked for. Falling for him was inevitable. I still remember how the usually stoic Henry openly wept in the hospital when our daughter Julie was born 2 years ago. My father is living well in Montana. The photos he sends every month show the robust man he once was. I live each day with gratitude for the mysterious bond forged, thanks to Sophie. Every time I look up at the starry night sky, I search for Sophie's star.